All right, we got a hot one today. This is the PG27AQDP from Asus. This is 27-inch, 1440p, 480Hz, and it's using the same latest gen LG W OLED panel that we saw recently on the LG Dual Mode. Even though speed is the main attraction here, there's tons of features that make this really flexible and a strong contender for a one-and-done main monitor. So the copy I have here today is very early. This is called a DVT sample, so it's like a pre-production. Now the panel and the features are very representative of what we'll see in the final retail. The industrial design is not. The stand is final. It's the same from the PG27AQDM, but the back of the case on this one will be partially transparent in the final retail version, which looks pretty sick. And yes, you can disable all this lighting if you want. Obviously, we've seen a lot of OLED so far this year in varying configurations, so all the same stuff still applies. Still have a sub 0.1 millisecond gray-to-gray response. Still have self-lit pixels, which is great for HDR content. Still have that crazy contrast ratio that adds deep blacks and some real depth and dimension to any content. The big show is, of course, 1440p at 480Hz, and if you have a machine that can push that and games that can achieve that, it's a really insane experience. Anytime we move up in refresh rate, we get a benefit to both motion clarity and input latency. Here is what 480Hz looks like in comparison to the 360Hz we saw earlier this year on the Alienware AW2725DF. Just remember that to see results this good, you will need to be running at 480Hz with your game running at a locked 480 FPS. That's going to be a tall order for most games running at 1440p. This is really limited to a handful of light lift competitive FPS titles that can really take advantage. To make things interesting, we've also got ELMB here. Remember that motion blur technology works different on OLED than backlight strobing tech like we see from DIAC or ULMB2 because there is no backlight on an OLED. Instead, we're getting a black frame inserted between every live frame, so the panel is technically running at half the refresh rate, or 240Hz in this case. I have to be very clear that ELMB offers no benefit to 480Hz. What it does is take 240Hz that normally looks like this and makes it look like this. So if you have games that can hit a locked 240Hz, this mode is great for making the 240Hz look every bit as clean as the 480Hz. Clean, yes, but not as smooth because you're only running at half the refresh rate. There are some trade-offs to running ELMB, namely no HDR, no aspect control, and no variable refresh rate, which is irrelevant if you're going to be running a locked or capped FPS anyway. The other big hit is brightness, but it's far less impactful here than we've seen on previous monitors. I would assume because of the higher refresh rate, we're getting that black frame replaced by a live frame much faster. Standard full screen brightness on this panel without running ELMB is 263.7 nits, and running ELMB on, it's 164.6, which is still plenty bright, especially if you play in a dark or dim room. Looking at the 480Hz motion blur here versus the 540Hz options, it beats them when they're not using a backlight strobe tech, and even when they are running DIAC or ULMB2, there are some trade-offs. The main image at 540Hz looks more defined, but there's also some doubling and inverse ghosting that we don't see on the OLED side. So yeah, the motion clarity here at 480Hz or even 240Hz is exceptional. The fact that we now have OLED hitting this close to 540Hz means I put far less stock in those monitors. Being limited to 24 inches or 1080p is going to be for a very specific market of competitive gamer. For everyone else, I feel like 27-inch 1440p offers a lot more flexibility. If you really want that 24.5-inch feel, there is aspect ratio control here to let you run in a reduced display area. Just be aware, again, no ELMB, no variable refresh rate in this mode. Still, it's nice to have. By default, it's going to set the monitor to 2368 by 1332 to preserve the pixel scaling, but I found you can run 1080p in this mode just fine if you need to squeeze out some extra FPS. You can actually get away with 1080p in full screen mode if you want. It's not great if you sit in pixel peep, but if you're in the middle of a fast-paced shooter, I don't find it distracting at all. That's unlike the 240/480 dual mode monitor where the pixel scaling is so bad it actually does affect gameplay for me. Variable refresh rate here is G-Sync compatible, and I don't get any flicker on my copy, not in the flicker test app and not in game either, looking for sections with darkness and decent FPS shifts. VRR flicker is really situational though, so they have included their flicker prevention tech that restricts the range where VRR operates. I've seen this work magic on certain titles on the 27-inch glossy 240Hz OLED that we looked at recently, but like I said, I can't get this copy to flicker. And speaking of glossy, the coating here is matte, which I'm personally sad to see, but those of you who hate battling reflections will probably be happy about this. I'll link the video up here where I deep dive into the difference between glossy versus matte W OLED versus the semi-gloss coating on QD OLED, but in my experience, I have found that glossy offers a more clear, crisp image versus matte. As far as I/O, we've got two HDMI 2.1 and one DisplayPort 1.4. So we are having to use DSC here to get this resolution at this high refresh rate, which is not surprising. They do give us the option to disable this if you need to. We've also got the standard Asus USB hub and audio courtesy of a 3.5mm headphone jack jack, no speakers. Not really going to dive too much into color performance because I'm sure they're still going to tweak a lot of this before final retail, but even this demo unit is pretty close to what I want to see. HDR performance currently sees a max peak brightness of around 775 nits, or they have an HDR 400 mode. The tracking is nailed on that 400 mode, but it's pretty clear to me they're still working on the tracking on the brighter modes. Despite that graph looking a little rough, the actual experience is solid. It's not going to get you quite to like the PG32 UCDM, which is currently the gold standard for me for HDR in a desktop monitor, but it still looks very good. Asus has added even more burn-in protection features here, and look, I'm at a point where I just really don't worry so much about burn-in anymore. All these panels are warranted for 3 years, including burn-in protection anyway. I'm now 100% OLED in the studio at all 3 stations. My oldest one is 3 years old now. No burn-in, no image retention, and they have vastly improved the technology to prevent this. As far as text clarity, I am very happy to report that we do have the new gen sub-pixel layout, the RGWB, and that gives us what I think is the best text clarity we've seen so far from OLED, even at 1440p, even at 150% scaling. They've also added some AI features in here because, of course, they have. I don't have a lot of documentation on these. One is a crosshair that seems to change to a different color depending on what you have targeted. There's an AI sniper mode that shows a zoomed in bubble over your target. Now that's obviously just cheating, so much so that it puts up a big practice mode tag on the screen when you're using it, and honestly, I find it to be more distracting than anything in a fast-paced shooter. There's a couple other AI options here, but I find all this stuff to be either cheesy or cheating or both, so I don't really consider any of this a selling point. So yeah, a really versatile, really capable monitor. It doesn't do everything all at once, but it offers a really wide range of configurations depending on what you're doing. And even though I'm a big fan of the 32-inch 4K HDR experience for certain titles, 1440p is a lot lighter on your GPU, and 27 inches is a great sweet spot size. The real competition for this monitor is still the AW2725DF. The main differences are it's limited to 360Hz, which is still very fast, it lacks ELMB, and it's using QD OLED versus the WOLED we see here. We've already talked about those differences a lot, but in general, I do find that the colors pop a little more on the QD OLEDs, and I do find that the coating they use, which is like a semi-gloss on the QD OLED, does offer better clarity versus WOLED. But like I've said before, the worst OLED I have here is still miles ahead of any other monitor tech I've used. The other point is that AW2725 is currently priced at $799, and this monitor is expected to launch with a price of $999, with pre-orders opening very soon. Deciding between QD OLED and WOLED is more of a personal choice, but just keep in mind that the majority of games out there can't even hit 360Hz, let alone 480Hz, especially at 1440p. It's like the same 3 or 4 games over and over again that can hit 360, 480, and 540. If I were buying for myself, I would go with this, mostly for the ELMB performance at 240Hz, with the 480Hz just being icing on the cake for the handful of games that could take advantage of that. But only you know the limitations of your budget and whether or not you feel that 120 FPS in ELMB is worth the extra $200.